Let's go. Okay. So thank you to everybody for coming. Really, I appreciate it. Tonight we're going to begin with a little bit of a recap of the past two shiurim in order to better understand where we're holding tonight and why I chose this title for a shiur to speak about the Yotzerot. So in the last two shiurim, we introduced the idea of the first bracha of Berachas Kriya Shema, and in the second shiur we discussed the kedusha of Kriya Shema. Now, we learned that in the time of the Tanoim, or earlier, even in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, it is very likely and most likely that a bracha for Kriya Shema existed. In fact, it is most likely that many brachas for Kriya Shema existed. However, by the time of the Tanoim set down the law that one should only say two brachot before Kriyat Shema. In their time, there still wasn't something called a Berachas HaMitzvahs, so it didn't develop into Asher Kedushanim and Seisa B'Tzivanu, because they didn't have that yet. However, the two most popular, most beautiful brachas that they chose were Yotzer and Avat Olam. That's the picture we got from the first year. Yotzer is a bracha on sunrise, the daylight, the creation, and Avat Olam is a kind of Birchas HaTorah which introduces us to the saying of Shema Yisrael, which is a reading from a portion of Torah. Okay, it's likely that they said something like this in the Beit HaMikdash, and there were likely many other versions. The first evidence we had, I believe, for Yotzer are the first words are in the Gemara itself. The later words we have evidence for in other places, right? So the Yotzer that we have today is greatly expanded. However, and I'll share my screen with you. Let me share the screen again. Here we go. The original version, at least according to many scholars, the original version of Yotzer is much shorter. Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu Haolam, Yotzer v'Roich Osa Shalom, Uveris Kol Amir, La'aretz Yodanu Le'Ber Rachamim Rabim, V'Tuvam Mechadesh B'Chol Yom Tovim Ma'aseh Bereishis, Baruch atah Hashem, Yotzer Beracha. That is the entire bracha. Many scholars see this as the nucleus and the core, the original bracha of Yotzer. But later, there was something added to the middle of Yotzer called the Kedusha. Now, that's what we discussed last week. Now, I oversimplified certain things, but the gist of it is some scholars see this as an expansion. A minority of scholars see this as a contraction. In other words, some see this as an abridgment. Now, this is just an abridgment for the longer Kedusha, and the longer one was always the longer Yotzer, and the one that we have today was always the original. And yet most scholars see this as this is the original. The shorter one is the original, and Kedusha was entered in. Why would you say Kedusha was put into Yotzer? Well, think about it. The whole topic of Kedusha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the holiness of Hashem has nothing to do with Yotzer on first glance. So if the Kedusha and the angels have nothing to do with daybreak, why would it be in here? It seems like it's forcibly put in. And when you look at our Yotzer, it's indeed that you do not see a direct correlation. Rather, in our version, we have an extra sub-rubric, which begins Marabu Masech Hashem, which transfers from the creation of daytime into the general creation of all things, and then it goes on to bridge into a discussion of all of the angels, etc. So I want to understand tonight more than just the Kedusha, and to understand all of the parts of Yotzer. Another thing I wanted to recap from last week is that, and this is because I found something this week that I wanted to go into, is that because there's this disunion between the topic of daybreak and the sun and the moon, and the topic of the Malachim, many believed that it came from the Mekubalim and the mystics and the Hasidim, who believed in the idea of the Yeridat HaMerkava, the idea of going down into the celestial spheres, or the vision of the chariot. So what I didn't know was that in one of the versions of the Seder of Amram, this is the one of the first Hidurim published by Amram Gaon in roughly the 8th or 9th century. In one of the versions, there's an interpolation where one of the scribes added that he adds a sort of medrash, and in the medrash it says, I wonder if I have time to share it tonight. I do not. But in the Midrash, it says how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu likes the Kedusha, and look at how the Yardei Merkava, those who descended into the vision of the chariot, how they taught us to say the Kedusha. So many scholars, as we saw last week, understood the Kedusha to be something invented by the mystics and pushed into the bracha. So now, which mystics are we talking about? Are we talking about Mekubalim that are really ancient, or are we talking about Mekubalim in the time of the Gaonim? That was also a discussion. Maybe it was the Essenes, the mystical sect that we know from the Dead Sea, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls. Maybe it was the Gaonim from the mystics in the time of the Gaonim and Bavel, who also were very into ideas like the Heichalot and wrote chapters on visions of the angels. What we noted last week is that there's been a pushback on this. Perhaps, if you think about it, in many places in Shas, we talk about the Malachim and we talk about things that go on in Shemayim, and it's not really mystical. The Gemara doesn't always talk about things that happen in Shemayim as if it's like super Kabbalah. So maybe it's possible that the Chachamim who composed Yotzer and put the Kedusha in, we're not doing it for mystical purposes, and they themselves weren't mystical. That's also a real possibility. And we also don't know exactly, we cannot say based on that timeline that it was definitely done in the time of the Senes or definitely done in the time of the Gaonim. It's possible that it wasn't mystical at all. And even if you were going to say that it's mystical, we don't know exactly when the Sifrei HaChalis were written, so it's very difficult to date that the section of Kedusha. Now, to better understand what I want to, what I want to discuss tonight is that I want to go piece by piece and understand the bracha of Yotzer on a deeper level. So if we look here, I'm going to pull up a sheet here that I created this sheet last week. I call this divided by subrubric. That's just the PDF I created for everybody's ease of use. Give me a second to share my screen. Wow, there we go. Okay, so this is the bracha of Yotzer. Section 1, subrubric 1, right, is the first half of Rav Sadia. And the last half is also the main sections of the bracha. Everything in between is extra. Let's look at the first part, number 2. Marabu ma'asecha Hashem kulam b'chachma asisa mal ha'aretz kinyanecha. Just a pasuk from Tehillim. That's a bridge, because originally you're talking about about the creation of the sun and the moon, and suddenly you want to start talking about the angels. So in order to bridge that, you have to give a general statement. How great are all of your creations, God? Then it continues that theme in another sentence, which is not a pasuk. Right, the king who ruled since he created the entire world and who's been the exalted ruler from ancient times. Then number 4 is very strange, but it exists in almost every single version of Yotzer that we have, going back to the most ancient manuscripts we have. Contains some form of petition. For some reason, the people who composed this sentence decided that this was an appropriate place to add a petition to Hashem, a techina, a supplication. Adayom said we don't know why. The commentators speculate that perhaps the creation of the moon is known to be a creation of mercy, right? The creation of the sun and moon. Hashem understood that the Medrash says that Hashem created the world with din, and then he saw it couldn't survive, so he added rachamim, and this is represented in the creation of the sun and the moon and the renewal of the moon. Perhaps it's trying to say that the celestial spheres were created with rachamim, and therefore we should get a supplication. This is what the commentators more recently have been speculating, but till today we don't really know why there's a techina in middle of Yotzer. Number 4 is a Piyyut. This is literally a poetic expansion, which we'll discuss in a minute. Then you have number 6 is Tisparach Hashem Elokeinu. We have 2 sections which begin Tisparach. This is also somewhat poetic, and it's an introduction to a passage into the full introduction to the Kedusha. The introduction to the Kedusha is really the assembly of the angels. And in the versions we have today, as you see, I've highlighted many of the entire sentence is built around the word kulam. Kulam omdim berum olam, kulam burim, kulam giborim, kulam osim be'emavriot son konehem. So we have this poetic section which seems to focus on the word kulam. The version we have today is very expanded, but we see this idea from much older times. Then we have the section of the Ofanim. As we discussed last week, there's been this linkage between what the Malachim, the higher Malachim say, and the Ofanim. this linkage has been there since at least the time of the Tosefta. The Tanoim at least understood that there was a relationship, that when the Malachim said Kadosh, 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 they were followed by the Ofanim when they said Baruch Kvod Hashem Imkomo. It says this in the Gemara, it says this in the Tosefta. So this so-called response of the Malachim was well known in the time of the Tanoim. Finally, we have a closing with Alkel Baruch Nu Motutenu and Machadish B'Tuvo Chol Yom Tamid Maaseh Bereshit, which is a way to bring us back to the original beginning of the bracha. Okay, that's what we have for now. Now, one last thing I wanted to show you was that there were other versions of Yotzer. However, not all of them survived. Now, the core text, the core, how should I say, the core idea of Yotzer, the way we have it, existed. But in the time of the Paitanim of Eretz Yisrael, there were versions of Yotzer which were simply poetic and had a completely different version. And it's things like this that I actually wanted to discuss tonight. Look just here as an example. It's a good introduction. This is from the Revue de Etudes Juifs in 1907. I couldn't find the actual manuscript in time, so I'm just showing this here. Here we have Yotzer called Or Olam, or Tzer Chaim, Orot Me'ofel, Omer Vayihi, Asher Berov Chochma, Kidula Darash. Just like, if you recall, just like Kel Baruch Kidol Daya, this is also an alphabetic acrostic. Asher Berov Chochma, Kidula Darash, Bechin Vitkin Ziv Chamato Tipecha Yemino, Kochvei Levana Me'or Neiro, Sod Olamo Paletz Kol Krovei Rachamav, Shir Tishpachot, Nina'in Lo. Eit Yashmiel Etzion Kumi Areki Kakatuv Kumi Areki Ba'arech V'Vod Hashem Alayach Zerach V'Vod Hashem Yotzer Marot. And the next part is Geffen Mitzrayim, because that's we'll discuss next week. Geffen Mitzrayim, which is from Avat Olam. Okay, so what in the world is going on here? Why is there a different version of Yotzer? So to understand this, to understand how Yotzer developed into the expanded version we have today, one has to understand the very early history of Piyyut itself. Now, Piyyut, or Jewish hymnography, and we're not going to go in depth tonight because we simply don't have time, but Jewish hymnography itself is really a branch of Jewish poetry. Jewish poetry, of course, if we take it in the global sense, in the secular sense, if we take the idea of Jewish poetry goes back millennia to biblical times. So all the way from Navi, we have poetry all over Tanakh. From the earliest Sfarim in Tanakh, we find poetry. However, after biblical times, Jewish poetry also lived both in Hebrew and in other languages, such as Aramaic, in the secular form as well. Now, while we have a lot of information from the 12th century and the 13th century about the great renaissances of Jewish poetry and Jewish Piyyut from those eras, what's much less well known and much less well understood is the poetic explosions that occurred in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, which is, almost 1700 years ago. But from the very limited evidence that we have, a lot of this stuff is really copies of copies and remnants of papyri. But from the earliest evidence we have, archaeological evidence that is, it seems that poetry was a very big part of Jewish culture, both in Israel and in Babylonia. And Jews wrote poetry for all sorts of occasions, for dirges and elegies, for times of joy, times of sadness. Many of them were secular. Many of them were just, in a sense, not liturgical whatsoever. And most of them, as far as we could tell, were written in the colloquial Aramaic of their time. Now, it's very difficult in a culture that we live in today in 2024, for my peers, at least, that we live in America, or if you live in Israel, or wherever you live today, most Western countries are not heavily into poetry today. That's not a deep part of our culture. But imagine you took an alien, you brought him down to earth, and you said, listen to this music, and he doesn't understand why it's pleasurable. In the same vein, there's a large number of people who can hear or read poetry, and they might not understand anything pleasurable about reading or hearing poetry. It's just not on your wavelength. Now, there are cultures like in India today where people are still into this, but the vast majority of people are simply not into it. If it doesn't have a melody behind it, it's not music. A lot of people really aren't into poetry, but for many people, and many people being a small minority of the global population, but again, many people, love poetry, and it's for them, poetry is a great pleasurable activity, and it's a tremendous part of culture and art for a lot of people today. However, because most people in at least in my peer group don't really understand this, it's just going to take a little bit more explaining. Now, in their times, in the times of the 5th and 6th century, even the 4th century, we find that a lot of this poetry began to move into the synagogue. And the leaders of the congregations in the synagogues were more than just prayer leaders. Many of them were there to entertain. They were there to make the prayers less boring, to put it simply. And I'm just here, if you're wondering what this still is, this is an ancient shul in Golan Heights, called Ein Kishatot. It's one of the most, it's very fascinating. It's like a 5th or 4th, I think it's 5th or 6th century synagogue that only got destroyed in like the year 749 from an earthquake. They reconstructed all the bricks that had fallen down. But this kind of synagogue would be very would be quite representative of a synagogue in Eretz Yisrael in that era. And when people would come to shul, for many of them, the standardized prayer was not enough. It wasn't enough. It wasn't exciting enough. And the chazanim were more than just cantors. They were also cantor poets. They were there to spruce up the tefillah, and they were there to also give a poetry reading of sorts. They were there to embellish the tefillah with a holy form of poetry, a liturgical poetry, or what we would know as a hymn or hymnography of their kind. So this developed kind of slowly, and it developed very much natively. What a lot of people don't understand about early Jewish poetry is that early Jewish poetry is natively Jewish. There's at least the way many scholars put this is that early Jewish poetry from what we call the pre-classical era, the classical era of Jewish poetry, is natively Hebrew. It's natively Jewish. There's not very much influence from other cultures into Jewish hymnography or Jewish poetry. Most of the development and the evolution of how the poetry and the art form evolved was very much native. It happened internally. It wasn't done from with external sources. It wasn't like one day the Greeks invented rhyme and then we're like, oh, what a great idea. We'll rhyme also. That's not exact. Well, nobody invented rhyme. I'm giving you an example, but it's not like Jewish poetry saw a lot of external influence. Most of the influence of the poetry that we see in early Piyyut is very much internal. Now, these early Paitanim, let's call them to periodize the pre-classical Paitanim. So let's say you take Paitanim from the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. These were people writing Piyyutim and the really earliest genres of Piyyutim. So let me give you an example of the earliest genres of Jewish liturgy, of Jewish hymnography. So one of the earliest examples would be the Seder HaAvodah on Yom Kippur. The Seder HaAvodah on Yom Kippur is one of the earliest poetic forms that we have, and some of the earliest poetry that we have into not poetry, but some of the earliest Piyyut that we have in the Jewish repertoire of liturgy comes from the Seder HaAvodah. Or if you take the Azharot or the Silichot, some of those early forms are representative of a very early prose-like poetry. We even find remnants of this type of poetry in some of our earliest liturgies, like Aleinu L'Shabeach Ladon HaKol, which is from the Shmona Esrei. Already in the time of the Amoraim, we find this type of piyut being done by the chazanim of their time, people who are on the level of composing and doing readings in middle of a Shmona Esrei and composing new things for a new Shmona Esrei. It's standard. If you look in the Gemara, it's very clear, and both the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi, it's very clear that the chazanim prided themselves with being able to compose and deliver a new type of prayer every time. It had to be halachically acceptable. It had to conform with the standardized prayer, and there was a standard formula, but as long as you could deviate within the halachic strictures, this was appreciated by people because people loved the poetry. They loved taking the liturgy to the next level. And this was something that appealed to the masses, or appealed at least to the educated masses. Okay, now one of the earliest forms of poetry, once you move past the 3rd and 4th century, one of the earliest forms of piyut that we find of liturgical poetry is the Yotzerot. The Yotzerot are, as it sounds, a type of piyut which embellishes the bracha of Yotzer. The bracha of Yotzer itself had a fixed liturgy. However, because it has a climax inside of it, where the angels come together and the angels sing to God, it's a perfect ground for the development. It's a perfect breeding ground for the development of more advanced poetry, and that is one of the earliest places that we find such poetry. Now, a lot of that style of early poetry is familiar to most Jewish people who have prayed a lot, but they might not be aware that they're familiar with those early styles. A lot of these early styles, and I don't want to get too technical because, especially, I'm not a highly technical analyst of poetry, but a lot of these early forms don't contain rhyme. These early poets, and I'm going to give an example here on the screen. These early poets from the early, what we call the pre-classical era, they liked tone, they liked rhythm, they liked simple meters. They also liked alliteration, which is when you have repetition of equal consonants. They liked alphabetic acrostics. They didn't really delve too deep in allusions. They liked symbols, but an allusion, like to allude to a midrash, not really. That came a little bit later. They didn't do sophisticated types of meter. They really didn't seem to use rhyme very much. And it's not like they didn't use rhyme because they didn't understand rhyme. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to invent rhyme. They didn't use rhyme because they just didn't like that poetic adornment. To them, that wasn't like perfect rhyme or even half rhymes at the end of a sentence. That's not like, if you talk to someone who's a real poet or a real fan of poetry, perfect rhyme is a very cheap form of poetry. To them, that's not like always the pinnacle of poetic achievement to give a perfect rhyme. So for them, they were developing all of their own poetry themselves, and some of this we're very familiar with. While biblical poetry is beautiful, like let's say, like beautiful alliteration and beautiful prose, this kind of poetry begins to take on the form of stanzas and quatrains and tercets and alphabetic acrostics, and we start to see an art form be born. Now, here's just an example on my screen in case you've never seen it this way. Anshe amuna avadu ba'im bekoch ma'asehem giborim la'amod ba'peretz dochim et hagezerot hayu lanu lechoma u'machazeh b'yom za'am. We find here, just as an example, a very simple poem. Or if you have Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol latet kidula Yotzer Bereshit, these beautiful, simple early poems that became a fixed part of our tefillah. Anshe Emunah Avadu is one of the earliest, but it's a form of silicha. And this is really, we don't see any rhyme at the end, but we see the understanding of tone and music and rhythm that they employ when they wrote these words. And even the power that the language has, without too much illusion, without too many fancy things. The words in and of themselves are powerful, and in and of themselves are beautiful. You don't need too much pomp and circumstance in order to make it better to understand. But when it comes to the Piyyut of the Yotzer, and I'm just sharing this breakdown here. I don't know if this is going to work with this. Here, let me try to do this. Okay. So when it comes to the Yotzer, originally with the Yotzer, very simple poems were added to the Yotzer. So you had things that were like a simple quatrains or one or two poems added into the Yotzer. And then over time, it developed into a more and more sophisticated body up until a point where on a weekday, when I shouldn't say on a weekday, but on a day when they didn't say Kedusha on Eretz Yisrael, right? In the weekdays, for example, when they said Yotzer, they didn't say Kedusha, only on Shabbat. So if they were going to do, let's say, Purim or Hanukkah, which doesn't have Kedusha, they were going to write a poem, they were going to write a Yotzer, so to speak, a Marechet Yotzer. They were going to write a bunch of poems for the bracha of Yotzer, they were going to add 5. It developed into 5 official sections, and each section has its own, features. One section is going to be an acrostic, one of them is going to be a tercet, the other one's going to be a quatrain, one of them is going to be this, and then 3 psukim. It eventually evolved into a set, fixed art form. It took about 200 years, but it did happen. And then on Shabbat, they would add 2 extra. So it wouldn't be 5 sections, it would be 7 sections. I think it was 5 to 8. They would also do a me'orah. They would do a michamocha. So, and a zulat. They added the zulat for Shabbat as well. And I'm showing here on my screen, if anybody's interested, just the borrowed from Wikipedia, the 7 different sections of this. These are the 7 different types of poems that are in a Yotzer. Today, if you speak to an Ashkenazi person, he says, "Oh, Yotzers, I know what Yotzers are because the Ashkenazim call all Piyyut Yotzers." But in truth, when you say Yotzerot, you mean the technical term means a Yotzer, which is written for a poetic oeuvre, a poetic portfolio written for the bracha of Yotzer art. Now, why is this so important? I took a nice long tangent to get all the way here and tell you about how in the 5th and 4th centuries, the Jewish poets were, the Jewish cantor poets, really, the Chazanim, were developing additions for the bracha of Yotzer when we said a Kedusha and when we didn't say a Kedusha. This is important because when you look at our modern version of Yotzer, almost all of it are the remnants of early forms of Yotzer. Now, these poetic forms that we find in our Yotzer can be easily compared to much earlier forms of, to not much, sorry, I shouldn't say much earlier, but similar and parallel forms of the Yotzeris in the Cairo Geniza that was dug up over the past 125 years by now, 100 more. So essentially, what I want to do is I want to show you some of the research done by Ezra Fleischer, just to give you an idea of how the Yotzer in front of us developed. So first of all, if you just mentally think about a bracha like Kel Baruch Gedol, not a bracha, a Piyyut like Kel Baruch Gedol Deya, if you take a Piyyut like that, it ends Kivod Kelu Kedushato, which means that it's an introduction for the Kedusha, right? The end of it, if you look at the last words, I'm sorry, let me pull up the sub-rubric again just so that I can say this properly. I'm sorry, I have Shabbat open. Let me do the regular one. It says at the end of Kel Baruch, it says, Pinot Tziva'av Kidoshim, Romame Shakai Tamid Misaprimis. Speaking about the angels, they all speak of God and his holiness. It's clearly an introduction to the Kedusha. Now, if that's true, if you think about it for just 3 seconds, you'll realize that Kel Baruch Gedol Deya was written for Shabbat. It wasn't written for the weekday because it's definitely written in Eretz Yisrael. And in Eretz Yisrael, they only said Kedusha on Shabbat. The Yotzer only had a Kedusha on Shabbat. And just by the style of Kel Baruch Gedol Deya, we know, just from its style, that these are from the early cantor poets of Eretz Yisrael, because the early cantor poets of Bavel were non-existent. They didn't have Piyyut in Bavel. So this was clearly written in Eretz Yisrael, and it's clearly a composition for the Shabbat. Now, it must have resonated with people. It must have been beautiful enough that they wanted to say it every day. And it must be that once the Jews of Eretz Yisrael started saying Kedusha, not just on Shabbat, but also on weekday, just like their brethren from Bavel, once they started saying the Kedusha every day of Yotzer, they carried along with them Kel Baruch Gedol Deya. It must be that of all the different versions that we have, like I just showed you Asher Berov Chochma, just as an example, of all the different versions they had, which were simple alphabetic acrostic poems, they chose Kel Baruch Gedol Deya as the one that they liked the most. Now, let me see if I can share my screen with you. Give me 1 second. Yeah. I'm going to share my screen just for a second to do justice to Ezra Fleischer. If anybody wants to continue this research, I'm sorry, I didn't have the right book posted here. But Ezra Fleischer has a book called Hayotzers, and I'm sorry, especially for the recording. The book here is available on Magnus Press. It's called Hayotzers B'Tavutam. Essentially, the Yotzros in their development. He wrote an extremely important book on the development of the Yotzerot, and he also wrote a separate, very important book on the development of the liturgy, which I just showed in Eretz Yisrael. Now, in his book on Yotzeros, he has a whole section just analyzing the various poems that they found in the Cairo Geniza for the Shabbat that was written by these early poets. And I just want to show you some of the most fascinating stuff from this book. To begin with, let's start with one of the earliest poems that we all know of, Lakel Asher Shabbat Mikol Ma'asim. I hope everybody can see my screen here because we're just going to browse the book together. Right? Kel Asher Shabbat Mikol Ma'asim. If you look here, Ezra Fleischer is a poetry genius, so he separates everything by quatrain. right? Beyom Shvi Yitalav Yashav al Kisei Kvodo. Tiferet Ata Liyom HaMenucha Ve'oneh Kara Liyom HaShabbat. Zeh Shevach Liyom HaShvi Shebo Shabbat Kel Mekom Asa V'tziva V'shavtu Imo Kol Divglei Yaakov V'asu Bo Menucha V'karu Lo Oneg. This is the original version. Our version today is truncated. But from the Geniza, we could see clearly this was the original full version of this poem. It's a quatrain with 5 stanzas. That's essentially how you put it. Finally, it begins with this whole praise of God, and then it ends with what the actual day, right? The 7th day praises and sings Mizmor Shir Le'Yom HaShabbat. What a lot of people don't know is that this is one of 7 piyutim, meaning there are 7 brother and sister piyutim to this piyut, and each one says V'yom Hasheni Mishabeach Ve'omer, right? V'yom Hashlishi Mishabeach Ve'omer, and we found these in the Karageniza. Here's the one for Thursday, just as an example. Let me go up. Here's the one for the 6th day, for Friday. And finally, at the end, it'll just as an example. V'yom Hashishi Mishabeach Ve'omer Hashem Malach Piyyut Lavesh. Every other day of every day of the week, they had a separate one. And over time, I mean, Elbogen discovered this already in the early 1900s. He discovered the one from Thursday. But over time, Ezra Fleischer, from digging through every section of the Geniza throughout the globe, uncovered one for Monday, uncovered one for Tuesday, and he basically rebuilt many of the sections of many of the brothers and sisters for that piyut. Also, we have here Asher Barov Chokma Gedulat Darash Hechin V'Itkin Ziv Chamato Tipecha Yemino Chovei Levana. This is essentially identical to what we have today of the Kel Baruch Gedol Deya. It's just a different version, and for some reason, Kel Baruch Gedol Deya rhymed better. It was more pleasing to the ears of the congregants, and therefore it stuck with them. He also shows a picture here of one of the more important what's it called? Manuscripts that they found, miraculously found. And here also Teshuah Shlema Ru Kedoshim is a continuation, which is instead of Aleph to Tuf, it's from Tuf to Aleph. It's the reverse acrostic, which continues from how am I supposed to say it? Asher Barov Chochma. Now next here he points out that in the Seder of Sadia Gaon, in the Siddur of Sadia Gaon, puts Kel Baruch Gedol Deya in the Siddur. And then he says also, some people say this instead, right? Instead of Kel Adon Kol Ma'asim on Shabbat, they say Kel Adir B'Marom. And Rav Sadia Gaon gives a completely different piyut, meaning in the time of Rav Sadia Gaon, people already understood that Kel Baruch Gedol Deya is an addition to Yotzer R. Or on Shabbat, when instead we say Kel Adon Kol Ma'asim, you could add an alternative. In the time of the Gaonim, this was still understood that you could just add an alternative. Some people like this one, some people like that one. And so here's just one of those, Kel Adir B'Marom. Is there anything else here I wanted to show? Azir Patsu is one of the important things that he uses for teaching exactly how the poetry developed. But essentially, some of the features you'll see with these piyutim is that they have a stress that, in the sense that the Chazanim ended up wanting to involve the Kihila. They wanted the Kihila to be involved. So there are points in these Yotzerot where there are pauses, and if you have to study it, you have to realize that when you look at the text, the way it's built is so that the Chazan could involve the congregation. They're not going to know what his next line of poetry is going to be, right? But they know what they know what the standard formula is. They know the rest of the of Baruch Hashem Yotzer Hamarot, or they might know the pasuk Kiba Kumiori. They might know the pasuk Marabu Masecha Hashem. And therefore, there are pauses and breaks within the poetic system in order to allow the people to join with the Chazan. And that's something that's easily demonstrated when you look at the earlier forms of the Yotzer R. And in some of the early versions in Eretz Yisrael, you'll find that they have in the Cairo Geniza a lot of the earliest manuscripts will have Kel Baruch Gedol Deya like put in the side, as if it's like, oh, if it's optional, if you want, say this. So, okay, this is just the Ben Ezra synagogue where they found the Cairo Geniza. Okay, now let's move on to the last part of, because we have 5 minutes left. The last part of the of Yotzer R. So the last part of Lakel Baruch Nemotitenu, Kayam Zimirot Yomeru, that's clearly a poetic me'orah. It's in a sense a way to end the section of the Kedusha with a very, very simple poetic ending. In order to bring back from the topic of Kedusha, you have to circle back to the original topic. What was the original topic? Yotzer Or Borei Choshech. You cannot have a bracha end with a different topic than it started. It has to begin, the bracha has to end with the same topic that it began with. So the Me'orah section, the Lakel Baruch Motitenu, is clearly a very early way of bridging back from the Yotzer Or topic and bringing ourselves back home to the idea of the Or and the creation of light. Now, one of the earliest forms we have of that is, I don't say this every day, so forgive me if it escapes my mind. The Sfardim don't say this, but after Ka'amur Orim Gedolim Lo Kilam Chasto, the Ashkenazim will say Or Chadash Al Tzion Ta'ir, a new light you should shine on Tzion. V'niske Kulanu Mehera LeOro. And we should all be zoche to bask in its light. Now, what happened with this is that this seems to be a poetic way of bridging ourselves back to the concept of Ar, of light. In the yeshivos in Bavel, they clearly had this minhag. We have a tshuva, and I'm going to show you here. This is the Shibbolei Haleket, the Sefer of Shibbolei Haleket from Rav Tzitzika Rofe. In it, there's a tshuva from Rosh Gaon, where he says that in both yeshivot, Surah and Pupadita, Surah and Arda, our minhag is to say this. Even though Rav Sadia Gaon came along and said, don't say this, even in his lifetime, while he was Rosh Yeshiva, nobody listened to him. Why? Because this is our nusach. What was Rav Sadia Gaon's problem? Sadia Gaon's like, what are you talking about? The beginning talks about the R that Hashem created in Sheshet Mei Bereshit. It's talking about the R that we enjoy every day. Not just really, and really in his words, it's the light that Hashem created every day. Why are you ending the bracha with an R that Hashem is going to give in the future? We're not talking about the R in the future. That was his critique. Now, being conservatives in the yeshivas in Bavel, they didn't want to change a thing. They liked that gersa. They thought that was part of the original nusach. They wouldn't budge. But many of the poskim, especially the Sfaradim, and even the French, a lot of the northern French, did not say Or Chadash Al Tzion Taviv for this reason. And I just wanted to show you, to share my screen with you, some of the very oldest manuscripts in the Geniza. This one here, I don't know if you can make it out, but this one here is here. Look here. It says Adon Haniflot, Borei Refuot, Ose Chadashot, Mechadesh Tuvo B'choyim Tamid Maaseh Bereshit, Or Chadash Al Tzion Ta'ir, Kadavar Shenamar Ose Orim Gedolim Kilam Chaso Baruch Hashem Yotzer HaMeorot. This is a very ancient girsa. This is not something made up. So there's different defenses in the Rishonim. Some of the Rishonim say, well, what it's saying is that Hashem should take that light that he created in the Sheshis Mei Bereshis and shine it upon us again when Mashiach comes. That's one idea. The Rush and the Rekeach have a different idea. They say, no, it's talking about the Medrash, the Gemara and Medrash. Hold on, I'm trying to remember. This is a Chagiga, where the Gemara says in Yudbeis, it says that Hashem created an R during Sheshis Mei Bereshis, which is too powerful for people to enjoy, and he was gonezet for tzaddikim. Hashem hid away this light that he created in the time of Sheshis Mei Bereshis. For the future, it's an Ar Ganos, a light hidden for the tzaddikim. So the defense of the Rishonim is that this closing of Or Chadash Al Tzion Ta'ir is talking about the Ar Hashem created in Sheshis Mei Bereshis. However, he's going to bring it back in the future. One of the arguments against saying Or Chadash Al Tzion Ta'ir is actually that one of the arguments against it. I'm sorry, we're actually about to start Kaddish. I have to pause the recording. 1 second. Just to end with this, one of the arguments against saying against saying Or Chadash Al Tzion Ta'ir is that why would you put the topic of Mashiach inside the Bracha of Yotzer Ar? Why are we talking about that here? The counter argument is that we say in Agila b'nismecha b'yishuatecha, even in Avat Olam. So clearly, the idea of Mashiach being put into Yotzer Ar is very early, and clearly it does have some place that it belongs. That's the counter argument. But we've run out of time before they're going to discuss Arvit. B'ezrat Hashem next week we'll discuss Avat Olam or Ahava Rabbah, depending on what camp you're in, and we will see y'all next week.